So let's see if this is working, shall we? Is this going to work? I think it is. Hello everyone, and well, I hope there's a few of you watching. Oh good lord, that's raced ahead, hasn't it? Yeah, that's really raced ahead. Hello. Now, I'm not that late. And, well, I've been having my normal fun, or rather, normal fun. We only just got rid of the plumbers at about 6:30, which is why I was testing the sound, because everything has been dropped on the floor today. Literally everything's been knocked on the floor at one point. Not by anyone's fault. I hate to say that, not by anyone's fault, but it's been on the floor, it's been picked up, and, well, honestly, because I've had so much trouble with the plumbers, I've actually forgotten to return the damaged copy of the Price of Victory I got. So I've been charged for that from Amazon. So honestly, that's probably going to go with the British Naval gun mountings to the Fleet of Oceans, if he sends me his address. If the Foo remembers to send me his address, I'll send him a message today. But if anyone here is watching who happens to be talking to the Fleet of Oceans, can remind him, he's supposed to be sending me his address so I can send him the books. Or rather, I was going to send him just the British Naval gun mountings, but now I send him my battered copy of the Price of Victory as well. As I seem to have bought 2 copies. Oh, well, life happens. I forgot to take it back with that. You've suddenly woken up with Accelerity and are looking... Look how... Just, yeah. Okay. I will get the Iron Brew down, because obviously you were looking up there to remind me of the Iron Brew, and as a reward of reminding me to get my Iron Brew down, I will give you a biscuit. How's that sound? But you do realise your mummy is telling me off because she thinks you're going to get podgy. So your mummy it's very upset with me, and you and I are both going to be on a diet past Christmas, and we are both going to be running around. Yeah. Thought that would happen. PT from all of you, yes. Alex Street. Well, Alex Street is here, and Alex Street is happening. So, hello everyone. Hello everyone. How are we all doing? Do you want to take a hot shower? How do I put this politely? We have now got hot water. We've got hot water. We've got everything running. We've got lights working. We've got plugs working in the garden. It's wonderful. Things are starting to come together. They'll be putting in a network next week. Network cabling next week, so it's going to be great. And then the internet speed inside the house is going to officially be about twice the speed we get off the cable from the internet from BT. But you know, we'll sort that out. Calm down. No, you're gorgeous, but no, stop it. Behave. That it is Arthur. Yes, it is. It's currently, he's remonstrating with me very strongly about the idea that he might be podgy. He's not podgy. He's cute. Hello, everyone. How are we all doing tonight? So, why has this come up with this as its front line, as its heading? Let me just go to the Monroe Doctrine. So, I have managed to write the whole sort of thing out without actually changing the front cover from when I got the front cover correct, because I quickly copied across the cover because I hadn't yet updated these. These being, of course, the few upcoming videos, which if you've been watching this channel, you might have seen have now been scheduled. So, we've got the anti-submarine warfare aircraft, we've got the premieres don't need to be scheduled, so they will be scheduled at a time once they've been recorded and uploaded, but they'll be recorded and then they'll be scheduled, so they'll go live as premieres. Yeah, Cat 7's not that expensive. It's fine, but in the nicest way, the internet in the house, as I said, is going to be faster than the BT internet provides outside. That's the thing. The cables in the house are going to be better than the cables which are servicing the house. It'll be fine. It'll be sorted out as time goes on. We've got World War I Tribals, the development intended use as a premiere. We've got Tacoromis, Royal Navy built 15-inch guns. And if you look at that one, you'll find that one's going to be on Boxing Day. That one's going to be on the 26th of December. So basically, you may want to join me for that. You might not want to join me for that. But I thought it'd actually be quite cool. And I've got permission. I am doing a live on the 26th of December. And the cousins who are going to be around have promised not to come bursting into my office. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. And then we have... Ooh, coming up as well, we have KVG, Flotillas of Danube. That's going to be a fun one. And we have guard ships, what were they and why? And we have Admiralty manages to get a blank check, which should be a fun one. All sorts of things. It's going to be a very fun, hopefully a very fun Christmas period. And alright, that's all supposed to sort of theoretically work. So, thank you everyone. Oh, yeah, it should all be good. Thank you, Baz. Now, I know, and before anyone thinks he's being very badly behaved, he's been sitting beautifully quiet on his own all day in a room while the people have been around here. Because, of course, if you know in the UK, the rules are basically... It's just easier for everyone if the dogs aren't out when the builder's around, because they might A, get out onto the road because of the doors being left open, and B, although you can imagine how likely that is to happen in our house, with my mum paying attention and me and my sister walking around, and B, because, you know, there are all sorts of reports which sometimes have to be filled in case a dog might bite someone, and it's a case of neither mine do. My corgi, of course, though, as you know, he's not that best to see. He has very narrow vision, and in dark spaces, if he does get caught, he reacts like a corgi does, not out of aggression, out of fear. But we deal with that. That's been okay. Never beaten anyone. He's mauled people, but never bitten. Mainly me and my sister, because it's usually us in dark spaces if we don't notice him. But he's always been good. But this one's always been fine. But still, they have to spend a whole day cooped up, and they never like it. You need a dog flat for your door officer, which is poodle size but not cousin cable. There is nothing that would be that viable. My cousins come in all shapes and sizes, and all sorts of fits. So it's all good. Right, so, Monroe Doctrine is today's topic, and that's rather an interesting thing to get into, because it comes about because there's peace in Europe. Yeah, this is a shocking, horrifying thing for the Americans, but realistically, the Monroe Doctrine comes about because there's peace in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars are over. There is the Congress of Vienna. There are all the negotiations going on, and this worries the Americans because their view is if the Europeans are no longer fighting each other, they might decide they wish to take over other empires. They might decide to wish to renew empires. And at the same time, there were a rather large number of colonies coming free from the yoke of Spain in the American possession. One interesting thing is the Americans both believe this is a great thing and also tacitly don't take any notice of the reason why those colonies are becoming free. Those colonies, of course, becoming free because Britain has been trading with them, even when they've been at war with Spain. And Britain has sponsored most of the independence movements. But, yeah. Mostly for Britain's own ends, by the way, because it means they become British client states rather than Spanish captured markets. That's basically the British idea going on. And they're very successful about that. They are very successful at that. But the Americans see this as a important thing, a really important thing. And this is despite the fact that they've just been brutally embarrassed in the War of 1812, where they started out with grand ambitions and ended up settling for everything go back to the pre-war status quo before the British, who've now finished beating up the Napoleonic forces and supporting that, turn them full might on us, because it turns out our not investing in a navy beyond frigates means that we have problems. We have a lot of problems. It's terrible, really. It's absolutely atrocious. And yeah, they basically come up with this doctrine, this doctrine, this idea of what America's going to be like, a relationship is going to be like with the rest of the Americas. Now, there's a small problem here. There is a very small problem with this. In that, and there's the reason I've got the title I have, A Living History of Rhetoric versus Reality. Sometimes the American rhetoric is very different than the reality. Sometimes it's different in terms of the reality of the relationship. You've got that more recently, where you had John Kerry put in his view of the Monroe Doctrine versus the Trump view of the Monroe Doctrine. I'll be going right the way through to the last Trump presidency and all the way up to, because my PhD's war studies, so we always deal up with, as far as we're concerned, history was yesterday, and you need to be able to learn up till yesterday. And mostly today's history as well, but, you know, we don't tend to count as history till to midnight. Today's still the present. So, yes, I'm going right the way up. And you've got various points at which the Monroe Doctrine is looked at as America being the primus inter pares of the Americas. There being the dominant nation in the Americas. There being the big brother. There being the leader. There being, you know, various relationships and various perspectives on that relationship have carried on. There's even, you know, all sorts of things that have been part of this. So yes, the Monroe Doctrine is very much a living piece of history. But there's also the reality that for quite a large chunk of the period of the Monroe Doctrine's technical enforcement, the Americans weren't really the enforcers of it. They really weren't. Because the same reason they'd found themselves looking at the War of 1812 going, this is not how this war was supposed to go! I know Americans get taught it's a glorious victory, but it really isn't. And I think Americans have stopped realistically teaching as much of a glorious victory as it used to be. It's not a glorious victory for the British either. The British really don't want to be fighting this war. They are far too busy beating up Napoleon. They really don't want to be bothered with America as well, who frankly have done tin pot investment in defence and are not really worth the British time of fighting a war. You know, usually the British could, most powers of America's level at this point, the British would probably bully without a war. But the British don't. Mainly because they don't need to bully the Americans. They mostly agree on most things and get along quite well. Yes, there are issues which cause trouble and friction between the two, but broadly speaking, their interests usually travel along roughly similar lines, so usually they work quite well together. And that's going to be the key thing with the Monroe Doctrine. Now, why am I doing the Monroe Doctrine today? Why am I talking about the Monroe Doctrine in live on my channel? Why am I doing this, going to all this effort? And it's not even the year of leadership, yet alone the year of diplomacy. Yet. Mainly because the Monroe Doctrine keeps coming up. And I decided that, frankly, I needed to cover it. I needed to get into the Monroe Doctrine. But the Monroe Doctrine, the big problem with the Monroe Doctrine is it's not actually a doctrine as you and I would think of it. Because if you and I were going to think of a doctrine, we would think of a stated document which is literally headed as, this is my doctrine, and I've written it out. The Monroe Doctrine doesn't work like that. The Monroe Doctrine comes from a speech given by James Monroe, who's the 5th President of the United States, in his 7th annual address to Congress, delivered on the 2nd of December, 1823. And basically, what we usually do, what most people do to the Rhetoric Doctrine, is they paraphrase these paragraphs from that speech and then declare that's the doctrine. So these very nice, I will say very nice because they are, 9 paragraphs are what are, broadly speaking, the basis for the doctrine. And people interpret it widely and wildly. It is a spread, a full display of interpretations are out there. It is as wild and as wide as you can possibly imagine. And yeah, they are part of it. But the thing is, this is why the Monroe Doctrine becomes a living document, because as it's these paragraphs, as it's not a codified document, or it's not a law written down, or an act passed in Congress, or even a proper report, let's be honest, people can read into it what they like. They can set it up as their straw man they're going to argue against, and our position is going to be different from that on the Monroe Doctrine. They can say it absolutely reinforces their position. They can say it doesn't reinforce their position. They can say this bit works and this bit doesn't. They can do what they like. It can be all things to all people. Here's the problem with the Monroe Doctrine, therefore. Because the Monroe Doctrine, therefore, becomes a catch-all excuse for a lot of different behaviour, some of which it was never supposed to encompass. And when I say never supposed to encompass, I don't mean that it's never supposed to encompass as in it's not enumerated by the doctrine and it's not something which Monroe would himself do. No, I mean it's stuff beyond which Monroe would never even dream of doing because he has no concept of it. And this is the problem. This is the problem. So the Monroe Doctrine is fun. And I'm going to read these paragraphs out so people can hear them, but yeah, I'm not reading the full document. If you want to, I've got a link which I'll put in the Long Patrol this eventually, which goes to the presidency site, which has the full address, and I will put the full address into the chat. So, for those who want it, this is where you go to get the full address of the Monroe Monroe's speech. Now, it was stated at the commencement of the last session that a great effort was then making in Spain and Portugal to improve conditions of the people in those countries, and that it appeared to be conducted with extraordinary moderation. It need scarcely be remarked that the result has been so far very different from what was then anticipated, of events in that quarter of the globe, with which we have so much intercourse and from which we derive our origin. We have always been anxious and interested spectators. The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments of the most friendly in favour of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on that side of the Atlantic. In the wars of the European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. It is also only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparations for our defence. With the movements in this hemisphere, we are necessarily more immediately connected, and causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers. The political system of all the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. This difference proceeds from which exists in their representative governments and to defence of our own, which has been achieved by loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity. This whole nation is devoted. We owe it, therefore, to candour and the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should not consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere, but with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as a manifestation of unfriendly disposition towards the United States. In the war between those new governments and Spain, we declared our neutrality at the time of their recognition, And to this we have adhered, and we shall continue to adhere, provided no change shall occur, which in the judgment of the competent authorities of this government shall make a corresponding change on the United States indispensable to their security. The late events in Spain and Portugal show that Europe is still unsettled. Of this important fact, no stronger proof can be adduced than that the Allied powers should have thought it proper, on any principle satisfactory to themselves, to have interposed by force in the internal concerns of Spain. To what extent such interposition may be carried, or on the same principle, is a question in which all the independent powers whose government differ from theirs are interested, even those most remote, and surely none more so than that of the United States. Our policy in regard to Europe, which was adopted at the early stage of the wars, which has so long agitated that quarter on the globe, nevertheless remains the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the governments de facto as the legitimate governments for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve those relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy. Meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none. But in regards to those continents, circumstances are eminently and conspicuously different. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, we should behold such interposition in any form of indifference. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments, and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. It is still true policy of the United States to leave the parties themselves, in the hope that others will pursue the same course. Now, what is this all saying? As you say, once you read through it, it can say all things to all men. Now, one of the interesting things is, of course, the War of 1812 had been pretty much them interfering in Europe, in a European war, or rather them joining European conflict, theoretically for gain. And one could say they've learned their lesson on this, because they're now saying, no, we won't interfere in European politics. But they're almost saying, as a result of this, you shouldn't interfere in us either. We won't interfere in your wars. Please, we won't, again. And in turn, you won't interfere in ours. Now, here's the thing. Think about the powers in Europe and how this affects them, how this is going to impact them, what they're going to think about this. Because that's where the interesting thing starts to come about. That's where the interesting discussions start to come about. Because the different powers in Europe are going to have very different views on this. And one of the most fun things, of course, is that Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria is one of the most ardent objectors to this. They find it cretinous. They find it absolutely rude of them to, Prince Metternich is a good example. It says it's a new act of revolt and, all sorts of other issues. And that's a quote which, by the way, is picked up by so many people. The Austrians hated it. But let's be honest, who cares what the Austrians think? They barely have a navy at this point. They barely have an army after all the wars they've been fighting on. We're talking 1823. There is only one power which really matters as far as Americans are concerned at this point. The same power which doesn't worry about Spain or any of the others because its navy has done what it needed to do. And pretty much as far as Britain's concerned, this is quite a useful document. Because basically it's the Americans saying, we kind of stabbed you in the back, Britain, in the War of 1812. We won't do that again. We won't do that again. Britain are going, yeah, if you won't, that's good. We'd rather not have to deal with that again. It's rather annoying to have to fight you. We presume, because we both speak English and both have a sort of broadly speaking law-abiding societies, we can have conversations and we can deal with our problems like adults. But no, as long as you don't attack us in the back, we don't mind. But also saying, European powers should keep out of South America. And to be honest, Britain has no intention of starting a next empire by colonizing South America. The only power, again, who could really muscle up the force to go and do that, who has the financial situation after having not been bashed over by the wars, because one of the things you always have to remember about Napoleonic Wars, and quite a lot of wars thereafter, up until sort of World War I, it's World War II is the first time it really gets affected. Britain's kind of the America of those wars. Okay? Think about this. Britain mainly commits a small army that acts as a nucleus, provides money that hires other armies, and its country doesn't really get touched. And it concentrates on building a navy. So a lot of the money flows into the economy and grows the economy. So usually while others are beating each other up and ravaging each other with sieges and destroying each other's countrysides, Britain is doing quite well. Whilst other nations are having their nascent industries wiped out by war, Britain's industry is growing. Let's be honest, that's the situation we're talking about. Britain has the population, economics, and raw resources, and both in terms of raw materials and financial capital, to grow its economy in those circumstances. And that's what Britain's been doing. That is the advantage Britain has had. This is why Britain ends up being the dominant power for the centuries it does. Because there managed to be a massive war in Britain, massive wars where Britain doesn't get touched. That's also caused a lot of capital flight from those countries as people seek to put their money in places where it's going to be safe. Where's safe? Britain. Major power, no one's going to be charging over it anytime soon because it's an island protected by a large navy. And the people who argue for the large navy are mostly the bankers and merchants and insurance brokers. The burgeoning middle class in London. So yeah, that group fairly happy. You know, this is the relation, and they have, by the way, very good relationships usually with New York and other financial centers around the world, even in this period. So Britain's the big power at this point. Britain doesn't want anyone else to start causing trouble in South America. Britain is very happy for those countries to go independent, because whilst America might claim no one can interfere, in reality those countries are going to become markets for British goods, for the British influence and the British power. Why? Because there's no other option. Britain has the world's largest merchant fleet at this point. They're the ones going to be turning up to trade. Britain has the navy, which is the British Navy, which can turn around to the Spanish and go, do you really feel like doing that? It's Britain which has been sending various admirals and other senior officers over to help the South Americans with their uprising. And yeah, lots of personnel on half pay have decided to, it's what you do as an admiral. If we think about a gentleman called Cochrane, etc. What you do as an admiral when you're a senior officer, when you're on half pay, is you take a ship to South America and join up. And you do that entirely on your own steam. No suggestions from anyone else. So realistically is, when we start considering the Monroe Doctrine in this period, we're talking prior to World War I, we shouldn't really consider it as a separate entity. It is an American policy, but it fits into Pax Britannica, and to an extent it fits into their shared values of neutrality to sea. But that neutrality to sea basically serves their needs of freedom of trade and freedom of manoeuvre, because both the Americans and the British are about free trade at this point. When it's peacetime, they're both about completely free trade. When it's wartime, the British are about blockade and restriction of free trade, because that's what serves their interests. And it's the same, by the way, the Americans. The Americans are very pro-free trade until it's against their interests in terms of conflict. Then they're all about, well, sanctions and blockades. It's the same with every power in history, by the way. Please don't believe anyone is perfect. Anyone is going to be uniquely a great nation. There's no one. It's kind of like Warhammer 40k. If you have no reference, then I apologise, but I tend to give this as a bit of a reference because in there's a faction called the Tau, who are perceived by many who've done barely any reading on the subject as being the nice faction. After you've done a little bit of reading, they become the nicest of the factions. And then once you've done enough reading, you realise they are just as bad as everyone else. They just have better PR. And they aren't as big, so they haven't done as long a list of things so far. So far. And that's where it sort of becomes interesting, as this sort of the perception of reality, because this is one of the perceptions put forward, this cartoon of America holding everyone else off with its rifle, and the British staring hard at Americans, but also holding everyone else back. Look at the posture of the cartoon. And I'll be getting to this cartoon later in detail, but look at this cartoon. Look. Whilst America, yes, is stoutly holding off John Bull, who's the representative of the British and all the Europeans behind him, there's also the fact that John Bull has spread himself out quite clearly in a way that holds them off. It's quite clearly that John Bull is also holding them back, holding them behind him. Now, one argument could be that's protecting them. One argument could be that's protecting them. The other one could be that, and I often find it interesting to me, because cartoonists to me are often very good windows into the souls of certain periods, of pretty much all periods, because cartoonists tend to be good observers of what around them. And if you think about it, you start thinking about the posture of people. There are two ways to hold back a crowd. To stand in front of them and try and bar their way. The other way is to stand in front of them as a leader and try and hold them behind you. And if you have both sides of that coin playing the same game and knowing it, well, then you can make sure everything works out as you wish, can't you? And this is the point of what we're getting to. The Monroe Doctrine can be all things to all people, and it's had many corollaries at various points and many changes. All worthwhile reading, all worthwhile investigating. But the point is, realistically, until the Americans build a navy which allows them to influence these events and actually patrol these areas, and actually has a decent navy, it is a piece of paper which is more useful to this nation holding the others back than this nation. There is more reality in John Bull holding them back than in Uncle Sam holding them back. Yeah. The other one's all posh nobles, but the British is the country gentleman who's looking very strong and very assertive at the front. Very, very strong. You all stay behind me. I'll deal with them. So it is about perception versus reality. Monroe Doctrine is complicated. It is. But the reality of America's ability to enforce it when it's first declared in 1823 is 0 to 0. That's why so many powers get outraged in Europe. But the thing is, the powers who get outraged are the powers who can't do anything about it. The powers who could do something about it mostly keep quiet because they're all looking at the really big power. If they want to do anything, as far as the British are concerned, it works for us. Because if the Americans hadn't said it, who would have had to say it? If the Americans hadn't made the loud declarations that no, you cannot go to Russia, to France, to the powers who were talking about re-establishing Spanish colonial rule, re-establishing colonial rule because that's the proper thing you're supposed to have. Colonies are not supposed to separate off in war and, redo that. If America hadn't said this, and the British had chosen not to break it, how would the British have had to deal with it? The British would have had to say no themselves. Which would have meant the British would have had to, might have ended up having to fight another war against them all. And they've just been through years of war. They don't want another one. So it's great. The Americans say it. All the other powers look at the British to break it. And the British just go, we don't care. But because the British don't break it, none of the others can. It works for both Britain and America. Honestly, there is part of me that sometimes wonders if this was set up. If there was an actual agreement going on in the negotiations which carried on, the relationships which had built up after the end of the War of 1812. I don't think you'll ever find documents saying such things. Both the British and the Americans understand the rule of, if the documents are burnt, or if they never exist, then there's no change of it happening. But it does work out so well for the British when they are dealing with a problem. The wars of Europe have been over for just long enough. The powers are starting to get back on their feet. They're starting to think about things. They're starting to get noisy. Oh, goodness. Oh, they're starting to get problematic. The last thing the British want them to do is start disrupting their trade links and their interests in South America at this point. But if the British say it, then you can build a coalition against the British. But you can't build a coalition against the Americans without the British because of the need for a large navy. So the Americans saying it gives the British to get out of the jail free card, helps the Americans starting to establish themselves on the world stage, and it allows the British to enforce it without having to declare it. It's useful. And I think also to an extent, that makes, some focus of the phraseology. Because look at the power which isn't mentioned here. Or rather, the powers which are not mentioned here. Because they're talking all about Spain and Portugal. That's what Monroe is talking about, Spain and Portugal. Not mentioning any other powers by name. So specifically trying not to give them an easy casus belli. Because if you did focus in on France, or focus in on Russia, you could have problems. No mention of Britain. Britain's the power which is most capable of doing something about it. But specifically, they are not mentioned. And again, that's a phraseology which does have some history. So yes, I do like to do in all my videos a shameless book plug, which is a thank you to you all for everything you do to support the channel. Thank you to everyone for all your kindness and help. Yeah. Thank you for helping out the Historiathon. All the admins and everything. Thank you everyone for watching the channel. It's always nice. I do advertise my books on this channel. I do hope there are going to be more books to be plugging soon. Thanks to your help again with the Historiathon, I've raised enough money that I can do the pictures for book 1. And so that should be out in March. That's going to be a March, hopefully, probably a late birthday present to myself. I'm going to give myself to realistically the end of March to put it all together and make sure I'm happy with it. I've got to buy some software and some things for it, but it should all be good. And it's fun, and thank you for that. And thank you for all your support, which made that possible, and made those 36 hours go by quite so happily. And this is what we're coming up. Now, I'm going to apologise because HMAS Castlemaine didn't come out on Monday, as it was supposed to, because of all the work we've had to go on. That's going to come out on the 9th of December instead, and I'm going to be delaying the 2 historian videos. But you're still going to get 2 historian videos. They're just going to run a little bit longer. So I'm probably going to run those till about the 20th of January. It should, they're gonna be fun. I'm recording one tomorrow with Glyn Stewart, which is going to be science fiction. Basically, how you build a fleet in science fiction. There was Simon Elliott earlier this week. There is going to be one recorded with Sal Merkiolagos. There is going to be one recorded with Harry Bennett. There is going to be, hopefully, others recorded as the time goes on. Marcus Faulkner has been talking away with me, and that's, of course, the gentleman who wrote the War at Sea, the Atlases, which I'm always raving about, and is also the person who wrote the absolute best journal article I've ever read and paper I've ever read on the Graf Zeppelin. So having him on this year seems to be absolutely appropriate for the year of the aircraft carrier. And if you'll keep nagging Drac, I might get him back again, because you keep putting comments underneath the video which me and Drac did together to test out the 2 historians scenario, and people seem to enjoy it. So yeah, I might get him back. I'll try and get him back, possibly. But also possibly try and get Gareth Edwards, Gareth the Brit, on, because I think it'd be fun to talk stuff through with him. Sal'll be an interesting one. He'll be him and me talking about logistics, and there's also hopefully going to be a few others as well. I've got a good few lists. It could end up being a lot more than 8 episodes, but in which case I'll just keep them going until I've used up all the ones for this season. Because I'm going to do 2 historians. They're going to be a Christmas thing, because it's easier to do in this period, because usually people are, whilst they've got a lot of parties, a lot of things on, they've also got usually quite a bit of time at home, and they can just sit there quietly talking. We can talk naval history for a bit. Don't worry, Drakenred. The mic check was because and I had everything set up and I'd forgotten I did. So when I pressed the system to start recording, I hit the start stream and went, oh, frigate. And sorted it out afterwards. So sorry everyone, that one was all me. Oh yeah, there are many, many things we can do. I mean, me and Jack could do a whole series of things we actually debate about. Or we could do a series of the topics of conversation we have on airplanes which distress other passengers. I would like to get the mighty jingles as well. Yeah, distressing other passengers. When you're talking about things blowing up and people are just looking going, should you be having this conversation in airport, or should you be having this conversation on a plane? You're going, yeah, we're having fun. Oh, it's fun. So, what was the initial response to the world? Well, as I've said, it was kind of interesting. To get back into this, it was kind of interesting. The initial response to the world was mostly, you have no navy, you have no army, what the frigate are you talking about? Or I said, this could be useful. This could be useful. It's more interesting what happens to an extent in Latin America and Central America, because their reaction is different. Simon Bolivar, who a friend of mine did an entire bachelor's dissertation and master's thesis on, was a really interesting and fun character. And he and most of the other Latin American leaders and Central American leaders were, to use a modern phraseology to describe them, realists. They really were. They had a fine sense of, well, it's nice words, but America can't do anything. And they really did worry about the Holy Alliance. They really did worry about what Austria, Prussia, Russia, etc. would do together. They knew that the Monroe Doctrine, without the British backing up, was basically not worth the paper it was written on. And so, what could they do? They basically spent quite a lot of time making a big fuss about praising it, but they also spent quite a lot of time making a friendship relations with Britain, doing the practical scenario. And in 1826, Simon Bolivar, who of course has been leading many of the troops which have been getting the independence, called upon, his Congress of Panama to host the first Pan-American meeting. They did not believe and would not really acknowledge that the Monroe Doctrine was anything other than a statement of national policy by America. They did not believe or even give it the weight of it being something that was going to provide for hemispheric action, is the phrase which has often come to the entire of the Americas combining. They didn't believe that. And you have to remember there are a goodly number of the South Americans who feel that as far as the Americans were concerned, i.e. the people from the United States of America, the only real Americans were themselves. They didn't trust them. They did not trust them. However, there are some practical implications as well. There are various royalist guerrilla formations still continuing their wars and trying to fight back. There is this picture, which is of Spain failing at the Battle of Tampico. But there are also some other practical realities. There is the fact that the British go in 1833, return to the Falkland Islands and go, this has always been ours. And believe it or not, when the British do that, the Americans do nothing. Nothing. The Americans do nothing. And there are many people who make a big fuss about this and go, this shows that America really didn't mean anything behind its reality, and confirm their suspicions of the Latin Americans' suspicions of the Americans. And realistically, it's 1833, it's the British and the Royal Navy. What the frigate could the US do? Go and have a look at the forces. If they want to do something, they need to invest a lot more money in building up their armed forces. I'm sorry. America has always had the potential to be powerful. It's always been a very capable and industrious people. But its governments have regularly made sure it have not invested in the necessary things for them to actually be able to do anything. So the British in 1833 go, it's us. And do you know what? The thing I find really funny when I see people writing about this and saying most of those governments involved in South American countries understand the situation the Americans are in. They don't expect the Americans to do anything. They don't believe the Americans have reneged or violated them or mistreated them anyway. No one expected the Americans to do anything, because what could the Americans do? This is the British in the 1830s. There is not a jot anyone else can really do. The nice way I just mentioned the Holy Alliance, which was Prussia, Austria, Russia, these big powers. And when they suggested we are going to reconquer South America, Britain had just gone, that would be interesting. And how are you going to do that? And they decided not to do it. The thing is, though, and this is the point recently, this is not, the Monroe Doctrine still isn't hollow boasting, because basically, the Monroe Doctrine at this point means no one else but Britain can interfere. That's fine for the British. And it's fine for the Americans. Because what do the British really want? The Falkland Islands. Well, that's their traditional, their fishery they've had for a while, a coaling station. It's an important part of Britain's naval and maritime capabilities. But are the British going to conquer Brazil? No. So, if you're being a realist, and you're an American, and you're thinking, right then, I need to make this as close to reality as possible, if I allow the British to have the Falklands, which are their own territory, and let's be honest, were theirs beforehand, am I losing anything? Versus the bigger table of what I'm gaining and protecting for my interests. Yeah. It's useful. In 1838 to 50, when Argentina decided to really annoy the British and the French, they got blockaded by the French, with logistical support provided by the British, tacitly. And the US didn't take any results to do it. Why? Why? Well, honestly, at that point, the Americans are pretty annoyed with the Argentinians themselves. So they were happy to let that go. Again, realpolitik. And then we have at certain points you have in 42, John Tyler extends the Monroe Doctrine to Hawaii. And he specifically warns, Britain, do not interfere with Hawaii. And the British go, if you want it, have it. We have no use for it. We really don't want it. It's a coaling station in the middle of the Pacific. Have you seen where our trade routes run? There is absolutely no value to it for us at all. Why the frick? If we wanted it, we'd already have it, and there'd be nothing you could do about it. So the fact we haven't already got it suggests we don't want it. We've been going there for a long time. A long, long time. You know, Captain Cook had visited the Hawaiian Islands in 1779. If the British had wanted Hawaii, by this point, they would have had over 60 years to get it. If they really wanted it, they would have got it by that point. That's the scenario here. Here's one of those things when the Americans go, no, you're not. And that's fine. The British don't want it, and the British don't care about the Americans saying it. But who are they really saying it to? They're telling the Germans they can't have it, because the Germans do want the Hawaiian Islands. Because the Germans are after things, and various other powers, or rather the Prussians are after things at this point. And various other powers are after things at this point. So, the British don't want it, so telling the British you can't have it is not going to upset the British, because they don't want it. And the Americans know the British don't want it, because as I said, the Americans are smart enough to work out, if the British want it, over the previous 60-something years, they'd have taken it. But the situation is fine. It's fine. it works. But you have other real problems, because for a lot of the time, when you have people like Polk, and we're going to be talking about him in a second, because he's really fun. Polk believes that, it's part of America's manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. And that, no European power should interfere with American Western expansion as well. So not only should the Europeans not interfere in the continent, they shouldn't interfere with the expansion of the United States. And he said that it's included in the Monroe Doctrine. We can go back to the Monroe Doctrine. There's nothing in there which says anything not to do that. There's nothing in there that specifically supports it, does it? Again? Anything to support manifest destiny and taking over the Western expansion of America? Not really, but nothing against it either. Alright. So carry on. Now, unfortunately for the Americans get involved in their own civil war. And with America involved in it in the 1860s, Spain manages to annex the Dominican Republic when it tries to go independent. Or rather, it reverts back to it, and there's all sorts of interesting things. And as soon as the American Civil War ended, the US government then said, well, you know what? We have all these armed forces from the Civil War. And Spain went, what? And the Americans went, so you're going to leave the Dominican Republic, aren't you? And they decided to extract back to Cuba at that point. You see, the thing is, when you do have armed forces, you can start scaring the smaller European powers. But this is the point about what they do in the Spanish-American War. They've already been doing that for quite a while to Spain. And with Emperor Maximilian, with Napoleon III doing all that, the British were... Well, the British found it interesting, because, let's be honest, as far as the British were concerned, who would want Mexico at this point? It was not really something they were thinking was something you would actually want or could actually hold. And so, again, it's during the Civil War. And by the way, it's also the Civil War period where the Monroe Doctrine is actually referred to probably as a doctrine. And by that, it's the Monroe ruling or the Monroe consensus, or there's various variations of Monroe and his theory, the Monroe theory as well as one of them. There's the great quote from Seward, who proclaimed in 1868, and he, of course, is after France was expelled from Mexico by Mexican nationalists supported by American arms and support, and possibly quite a large chunk of British money, but we'll leave that to one side. Seward proclaims in 1868 the Monroe Doctrine, which 8 years ago was merely a theory. So when he was talking about in 1860, it's a Monroe theory, but in 1868 is a doctrine, is now an irreversible fact. But please note again, when the British colonies merge into British Honduras, the Americans don't say anything about that. They don't worry about that at all. They really don't. But you have the Venezuelan crisis, you have all sorts of things which carry on. And things start to carry on at this point, but by the 1880s, What we're getting into is a full debate in terms of American policy, of whether they are the shield of South America and Latin America from Europeans, whether they are the interlocutor, the communicator between the two. So if you have a problem, you talk to the Americans, and the Americans talk to the South Americans and sort it out that way. Or whether they are the big brother. And this is a big debate. This is a big debate of what the perception is. What do the Americans see the Monroe Doctrine as being? Because the Monroe Doctrine has to be more than just, you can't come out to European powers, it can't come here. It also has to be something towards the South American powers for it to have value. And the North Americans need to have a strong military for it to be able to work. And at points, let's be honest, their military's been smaller than the South American powers. And the trouble is, as has been said in the chat, and as has been said many times, Latin American and South American powers have often problems getting into large amounts of debt. This causes problems. This really does keep causing problems, and it starts to cause more problems. And you can see that in what happens next. In terms of the discussions and the phraseologies and sort of what's going on. Now, what I will say, before we carry on too much further, hopefully that's all right. There is one other fact we have to talk about, because there's been a little elephant in the room the whole time we haven't mentioned. Canada. Now, Canada is fun. And there is this great quote, which is ascribed to him, that apparently he, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Canadian Prime Minister, in 1902, describes the Monroe Doctrine as being essential to his country's protection because it provided security for Canada, with the USN in the Pacific and the Royal Navy in the Atlantic making it almost impossible for them to invade. Small problem. In 1902, the US Navy in the Pacific is not even worth the title US Navy in the Pacific at that point. Their force is very much a East Coast force. They are starting to develop some assets out there, but they really haven't got infrastructural things. And they certainly haven't been the major fleet presence in the Pacific as often as they'd like. They have been a presence. They have, of course, done things to Japan, etc., and these things, and they have been a presence. But they're not really a guarantee of Canadian security at this point. And they're also quite a threat to the Canadians. In many times, the Canadians do consider the Americans a threat. But it's a nice conceit for people. Realistically, though, and I think the trouble is this statement is attributed to an earlier Prime Minister, I think it's more true of a later Prime Minister. I think once you get into the 1920s and 30s, then it's very true. And it is a factor of Canadian security. But also, because of the way the Monroe Doctrine comes, and because theoretically that means the Americans should, after the Monroe Doctrine, no longer interfere in their arrangements, in Canadian arrangements, that theoretically it means that they are free to assist the British Empire and be a good member of the British Empire with the knowledge that their next door neighbour is going to be fine. Now that has a bearing if you go back to, again, the War of 1812. Then, Canada had been fulfilling its role, being part of the British Empire, the colonies had been supporting Britain and taking part in the war, and the Americans decided to invade them. Now, if one checks out the history of the War of 1812, you'll find that most of the things ascribed to British soldiers, in terms of some of the burnings of certain things, are definitely British Empire troops, but are usually Canadian. Quite often Scottish Canadian, I should say. But there are a few others as well, other things involved. And they're fairly effective. I'd also say that this has skipped over. There have been ongoing issues between America and Canada in terms of America, Canada, and Britain in terms of relations, in terms of supplying of arms to Native Americans, because the British had treated them as independent groups, and that had been also a way that, of course, the Americans travelled with their westward expansion. But let's be honest, that had often been tacitly approved by the British in return because the Americans kept interfering in European wars by, I don't know, sending money, food, supplies, and other things to the French. So that's where the interesting thing about the Monroe Doctrine comes in, because the Monroe Doctrine not only says you can't get involved in North America, in Americas, but we won't get involved in Europe. This is why I say that that's why the British like it. Because it's basically the Americans going, we won't do what we did again last time. In return, please don't do to us what you did last time as well. We'll stop interfering in Europe, unless we're asked, probably by you. And in return, please stop interfering please don't interfere that much, and don't allow others to interfere in North and South America. And that works. That works. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to apologise now, but I've just realised it's reached the hour point, and as you all know, I have to insert an advert now to keep YouTube happy. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to apologise, but I'm going to insert an advert. Oh, there you go. Just tell me when you're back from the advert. Hopefully the advert didn't go too long. Hopefully it's okay. Sanford Thompson, when Mother Nature tries to kill you 3/4 of the year and the wildlife tries to kill you the other quarter, there must be people that live and thrive there. They're a wiry bunch. Yeah, basically, I have often said that the Cadians are drawn from a particular military history, and it's not really hidden. Hello, money. Accent in the back. Amazing! The problems that YouTube is starting saying we're having with the thing has gone away. I have to do that roughly once an hour. But yeah, basically. So let's start looking at the first real colonies. And this is Richard Olney. He is the 34th United States Secretary of State. He's in that post from the 10th of June 1895 to the 5th of March 1897. And what I find most interesting about him, about Richard Olney, is he is the 34th Secretary of State. He is serving at that point, 24th President of the United States. So there have been 10 more Secretary of State to this point than there have been presidents. There are ads during lives now. There are ads during lives, yes. There are ads during lives. I have no idea what they are. But I need to do roughly 1 hour to make YouTube happy. Okay, Melanie, why can't you get gift memberships? Because this is actually, I'm sorry if anyone's following this, but this has been an ongoing thing for the entirety of this channel, that poor Melanie has never been able to be gifted a membership. Why does YouTube not like you, or what setting have you forgotten to turn on? YouTube Premium also gets me higher returns from YouTube for some reason. They really like you having YouTube premiums. They really do like YouTube premiums. Yeah, they need to be appeased every now and once in a while. So, oh no, settings. Okay. So basically, Olney has a colony or interpretation. At the point when he declares it, he thinks of it as an interpretation rather than a corollary. Corollary is a sort of later phrase in that. And this was because of a specific dispute going on between British Guyana and Venezuela. And Olney decided in 1895 the Monroe Doctrine gave the United States the authority. Please note, this is what I'm doing. This is the interlocutor branch. The authority to mediate border disputes. Declaring the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its sphere is the law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition. Now, please note, the arbitration was... They had actually settled it by arbitration in 1897, and his corollary is defunct by 1933. But let's be honest, that's a pretty bold statement to make. A pretty bold statement to make. It's the lacking of linking your Google account to your YouTube account. Fun times. So, yeah, Olney basically says that now the Monroe Doctrine is a font of power. It's brilliant, isn't it? Again, please note, let's think about this. This is all coming from a speech a president made to Congress. It's not a law. It's not been passed as a passed at any point. It's not been written into the Constitution. It is literally an address discussing policy and the state of affairs. It's pretty much the State of the Union. It's his annual message to Congress. And this is now giving them the power to do all this. That's worrying me, Charles Moore. We're not going into that. Yeah. Yeah, the US does all sorts of fun things. So let's carry on. And then we have the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, this tends to be drawn from these paragraphs, which are from, guess what? His message to Congress. And I'll put a link into the chat again. Yeah. It comes from here. It comes from Theodore Roosevelt's 4th annual message in December 1904 to Congress. And this is where the Roosevelt Corollary comes from. And this is even more fun when we read it. There's a reason I've got a picture of him there with all this text, etc. Because pretty much the Roosevelt Corollary boils down to... And I would say this... It's not perhaps necessarily what Roosevelt meant it to be, but it's what it became. de facto that the US is now in charge of the Americas. But it also adds in that in the case of flagrant and chronic wrongdoing by a Latin American nation, in order they be able to intervene to prevent intervention by preempt intervention by European creditors, or prevent. Now, basically, what it means is these countries keep going bankrupt, and if we don't want to deal with actually fighting a war, because we can't actually fight a war because we haven't been investing enough in navies, we need to get in and pay their bills first. Now, it's used for various blockades of Venezuela and all these things. And Roosevelt sort of says we won't guarantee any state against punishment if it misconducts itself. But the whole point of their corollary is that we get in first before it misconducts itself. Before it's going to reach the point of punishment, we get in and take over the situation. We change the situation. And yeah, it pretty much de facto turns, theoretically, the Americas into the American Empire. That's what it's basically doing. Because if you think about it, that's how Britain treats India and Australia and its empire at this point. Especially the self-governing parts like Canada, etc., the dominions. They're running themselves, but if they managed to get into trouble with started to look like they were getting into trouble with anyone else, British government would step in and sort it out first. They would pay the bill if they needed to, and then okay, you now owe us, or something to sort out. So pretty much you are treating the rest of the Americas as an empire. Right, we are now into the 1900s, so no, we're not jumping back 43 years to ask a specific question about an individual ship sinking. If you'd asked that question about half an hour ago, it would have been appropriate. Now it's well in the past, and I'm not going to restate stuff which I discussed already. So yeah, this is the point at which the Americans start to go, okay, we have created an empire, theoretically, of protectorates, or, there are various phraseologies you can put around it. But it does cause problems. It does cause problems. Because again, this is America doing this. They're asserting themselves as a domestic policy without bringing in any of the Latin American or South American nations to agree with them. Not gone on side and not had a conference and said, yes, this is going to be our policy from now on. You can come to us. No, they are just declaring this. And it's by reading between the lines of a whole lot of text from an even larger body of text. Because let's be honest, Roosevelt was a historian. The man couldn't write 5-minute prose if his life depended on it. The man writes entire books on the history of the War of 1812 and on the various points of warfare there. He does not write short speeches. He does not pen a short phraseology. He believes in giving the full weight to the full phraseology and verbology at his disposal. And that's the thing. His life depended on him not being brief. Yes. He didn't even give a short speech when he was shot. So again, if you want to follow that link I put in there a little bit while ago, the second one I put in, that's a full length to the full speech. And you will be scrolling for quite a while. Stafford, I don't mean this in any way as a criticism of Trump, but I'm going to say this. Yeah, his speeches are warm-ups compared to Roosevelt's, okay? They are warm-ups. They are... You know, Trump might do an hour plus. Roosevelt would go, well, that's good. That'll be part one. That is Roosevelt for you. I'll do questions at the end. Yeah. Now, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Yeah, Roosevelt is this kind of right. But the trouble is, again, Roosevelt's phraseology, and I'm going to read this out, but if you don't mind, I'm not going to try and expand this up and read this on my screen. I'm going to literally go to the PowerPoint presentation I have, which I can expand to full screen, and I can zoom in on, because there's a lot of it. And I want to make sure I read this all to you, because... And I might even try to do a Teddy style of reading. We are in every way endeavouring to help on, with cordial goodwill, every movement which will tend to bring us into more friendly relations with the rest of mankind. In pursuance of this policy, I shall shortly lay before the Senate treaties of arbitration with all powers which are willing to enter into these treaties with us. It is not possible at this period of the world's development to agree to arbitrate all matters, but there are many matters of possible difference between us and other nations which can be thus arbitrated. Furthermore, at the request of the Interparliamentary Union, an eminent body composed of practical statesmen from all our countries, I have asked the powers to join with this government in a second Hague conference, at which it is hoped that the work already so happily begun at the Hague may be carried some steps further towards completion. This carries out the desire expressed by the first Hague conference itself. It is not true that the United States feels any land hunger or entertains any projects as regards the other nations of the Western Hemisphere, save such as are for their welfare. All that this country desires is to see the neighbouring countries as stable, orderly and prosperous, and any country whose people conduct themselves well can count upon our hearty friendship. If a nation shows that it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters, if it keeps order and pays its obligations, it need fear no interference from the United States. Chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant case of such wrongdoing or impotence, to exercise of an international police power. If every country washed by the Caribbean Sea would show the progress in stable and just civilization with which with the aid of the Platt Amendment Cuba has shown since our troops left the island, and which so many of the republics in both Americas are constantly showing, all question of interference by this nation with their affairs would be at an end. Our interests and those of our southern neighbours are in reality identical. They have great natural riches, and if within their borders the reign of law and justice obtains, prosperity is sure to come to them. While they thus obey the primary laws of civilized society, they may rest assured that they will be treated by us in the spirit of cordial and helpful sympathy. We would interfere with them only in the last resort, and then only if it became evident that their inability or unwillingness to do justice at home and abroad had violated the rights of the United States or invited foreign aggression to the detriment of the entire body of American nations. It is mere truism to say that every nation, whether in America or anywhere else, with desire to maintain its freedom to its independence, must ultimately realize that the right of such independence cannot be separated from the responsibility of making good use of it. I'm only on paragraph 2, by the way. I'm now starting paragraph 3. I just feel you should realize this fact. In asserting the Monroe Doctrine in taking such steps as we have taken in regard to Cuba, Venezuela, and Panama, and in endeavouring to circumscribe the theatre of war in the Far East and to secure the open door in China, we have acted in our own interests as well as in the interest of humanity at large. There are, however, cases in which, while our own interests are not greatly involved, strong appeal is made to our sympathies. Ordinarily, it is very much wiser and more useful for us to concern ourselves with striving for our own morale and material betterment here at home than to concern ourselves with trying to better the condition of things in other nations. We have plenty of sins of our own to war against, and under ordinary circumstances we can do more for the general uplifting of humanity by striving with heart and soul to put a stop to civic corruption, to brutal lawlessness and violent race prejudice here at home than by passing resolutions about wrongdoing elsewhere. Nevertheless, there are occasional criminal crimes committed on so vast a scale and of such peculiar horror as to make us doubt whether it is not our manifest duty, please note, to endeavour at least to show our disapproval of the deed and our sympathy with those who have suffered by it. The cases must be extreme in which such a course is justifiable. There must be no effort made to remove the mote from our brother's eye if we refuse to remove the beam from our own. But in extreme cases, actions may be justifiable and proper. What form the action shall take must depend upon the circumstance of the case, that is, upon the degree of the atrocity and upon our power to remedy it. The cases in which we could interfere by force of arms, as we've interfered to put a stop to intolerable conditions in Cuba, are necessarily very few. Yet it is not to be expected that a people like ours, which in spite of certain very obvious shortcomings, nevertheless as a whole shows by its consistent practice its belief in the principles of civil and religious liberty and orderly freedom, a people among whom even the worst crime, like the crime of lynching, is never more than sporadic, so that individuals and not classes are molested in their fundamental rights. It is inevitable that such a nation should desire eagerly to give expression to its horror on such occasion, like that of the massacre of the Jews in Kinshef, or when it is witnesses such a systematic and long-extended cruelty and oppression as the cruelty and oppression of which the Armenians have been the victims, and which have won for them the indignity, pity of the civilized world. Even where it is not possible to secure in other nations the observance of the principle which we accept as axiomatic, it is necessary for us to firmly to insist upon the rights of our own citizens, without regard to their creed or race, without regard to whether they were born here or born abroad. It has proved very difficult to secure from Russia the rights of our Jewish fellow citizens to receive passports and travel through Russian territory. Such conduct is not only unjust and irritating towards us, but it is difficult to see its wisdom from Russia's standpoint. No conceivable good is accomplished by it. If an American Jew or an Armenian American Christian misbehaves themselves in Russia, he can at once be driven out. But the ordinary American Jew, like the ordinary American Christian, would behave just about as he behaves here. That is, behave as any good citizen ought to behave. And where this is the case, it is a wrong against which we are entitled to protest, to refuse him his passport without regard to his conduct and character, merely on racial and religious grounds. In Turkey, our difficulties arise less from the way in which our citizens are sometimes treated than from the indignation inevitably excited in seeing such fearful misrule as being witnessed both in Armenia and Macedonia. The strong arm of the government in enforcing respect for its just rights in international matters is the Navy of the United States. I most earnestly recommend that there be no halt in the work of upbuilding the American Navy, that there is no more patriotic duty before us as a people than to keep the Navy adequate to the needs of this country's position. We have undertaken to build the Isthmian Canal. We have undertaken to secure for ourselves our just share in the trade of the Orient. We have undertaken to protect our citizens from proper treatment in foreign lands. We continue steadily to insist on the application of the Monroe Doctrine to the Western Hemisphere. Unless our attitude in these and all similar matters is to be but a mere boastful sham, we cannot afford to abandon our naval program. Our voice is now potent for peace, and is so potent because we are not afraid of war. But our protestations upon behalf of the peace would neither receive nor deserve the slightest attention if we are impotent to make them good. Those are but 5 paragraphs in many, many paragraphs of this speech. I'd like to point that out, okay? 5 in many, many, many paragraphs of this speech. And this is my point. They do not make them like Teddy Roosevelt anymore. You will not find orators like that becoming politicians. Because today, it's all about the sound bites. I'm sorry it is. Politicians aren't rewarded for being quite as verbose as that. In a nicer way, this speech is not made for the Twitter age. This speech is not made for the TikTok era. This is a speech which is made for, yeah. In a Scouse accent. No, I'm not doing in a Scouse accent. But yeah, it is basically this whole Corollary is in many ways about also about Roosevelt justifying his Navy buildup. And yeah, Roosevelt is just yeah, it's a solid wall of text, and I tried to, because I've listened to some, there are some recordings and things going around, and people who've tried to speak in his tempo and style, and I tried to get the style right, not the I couldn't get the phraseology quite right. Yeah, and yeah, Trump had asthma. Not Trump. Teddy Roosevelt had asthma, and he still does. He was special. But yeah, believe it or not, the in many ways the treaties and things he submits to the Senate, etc., and stuff he gets put through, give the Roosevelt Corollary far more legal standing than the Monroe Doctrine. But by this point, the Monroe Doctrine is considered article of faith by the Americans. And that leads us into the Lodge Corollary. This is what I love that comes next, because basically the Monroe Doctrine, then the Lodge Corollary, is passed in 1912. And it expands the doctrine even more to cover not just governments, but corporations. And it's specifically focused on Japan. There are, I think, some recordings. I think Man in the Arena is recorded. The Library of Congress has some recordings of him. I think they come from his 1912 campaign speeches. And this is the Lodge Corollary. The Lodge Corollary comes afterwards, and as I said, basically, the Lodge Corollary is a, how do I put this politely? It's Henry Cabot Lodge, a U.S. senator, basically trying to make it so that no other government nor company can acquire sufficient territory, and that's the phrase, sufficient territory in the Americas to put their government in a practical position of control. It was all because the Japanese were buying up a section of California, of Mexican California, and in around Magdalen Bay. Basically, the Lodge Corollary forces means the Japanese government goes, well, we have nothing to do with this. It was just our companies, and the companies don't stay involved in it. But This is a copy. This is his defense. This is what he says in defense of it towards the 62nd Congress. This is what he says about it. And it's important to understand what the opinion is at this point of the Monroe Doctrine in the American political sphere, because it's always far more about domestic relations and domestic perspective than it is about international perspective. Or rather, as much about domestic as it is international. And resolved that when any harbour or other place in the American continents is so situated that the occupation thereof for naval or military purposes might threaten the communications or safety of the United States, the government of the United States could not see without grave concern the possession of such harbour or other place by any corporation or association which has such a relation to another government, not American, as to give that government practical power of control for national purposes. Really rather interesting to read this with a view to who's been buying what ports around the world recently, if we think about it. From the American perspective, and how they've acted, and what's been acted over it. This resolution rests on a generally accepted principle, the law of nations, older than the Monroe Doctrine. Really, there was a law of nations older than the Monroe Doctrine. The law of nations, most old general Monroe Doctrine, usually was a variation of might makes right. It rests on the principle that every nation has a right to protect its own safety. They do, usually by force of arms. And that if it feels that the possession by a foreign power for military or naval purposes of any given harbour or place is prejudicial to its safety, it is duty as well as the right to interfere. I will instance an example of what I meant by protest that has made successfully against the occupation of the port of Agadir in Morocco by Germany. England objected on the ground that it threatened her communication through the Mediterranean. That view was shared largely by the European powers, and the occupation of that port was prevented in that way. France was also kind of worried about it. That is the principle upon which the resolution rests. It has been made necessary by a change of modern conditions, under which, while a government takes no action itself, the possession of an important place of the character I have described may be taken by a corporation or association which would be under the control of the foreign government. The Monroe Doctrine was, of course, an extension of our own interests of this underlying principle, the right of every nation to provide for its own safety. The Monroe Doctrine, as we all know, was applied so far as the taking possession of territory was concerned, to its being open to further colonization, and naturally did not touch upon the precise point involved here. But without any Monroe Doctrine, the possession of a harbour such as that of Magdalen Bay, which has led to this resolution, would render it necessary. An association was evolved. To make such a declaration covering a case where corporation or association was involved. In this particular case, it became apparent from the inquiries made by the committee and by the administration that no government was concerned in taking possession of Magdalen Bay, but it also became apparent that those persons who held control of the Mexican concession, which included land about Magdalen Bay, were engaged in negotiations which have not yet been completed, certainly, but which have only been tentative, looking to the sale of that bay and land about it to a corporation either created or authorized by a foreign government, or in which the stock was largely held or controlled by foreigners. The passage of this resolution has seemed to the committee, without division, I think, to be of interest of peace. It is desirable to make the position of a country in regard to a question of this kind known beforehand, and not to allow a situation to arise in which it might be necessary to urge a friendly power to withdraw when that withdrawal could not be made, perhaps without some humiliation. The resolution is merely a statement of policy allied to the Monroe Doctrine, of course, but not necessarily dependent upon it, or growing out of it. When the message came in, I made a statement as to the conditions of Magdalen Bay, which had led to the resolution of inquiry, and which has now led to the subsequent action of the committee. It seems to the committee that it was very wise to make this statement of the policy at the time, which it can give offence to no one and makes the position of the United States clear. Of course, I need not to say to the Senate that the opening of the Panama Canal gives the question of Magdalen Bay and that of the Galapagos Islands, which have been once or twice before considered, an importance such as they have never possessed. And I think it eminently desirable, in every interest, that this resolution should receive the assent of the Senate. Please note, this entire resolution is about a bay in Mexico. I'm sorry, when you start to consider that they are literally passing a resolution about a bay in another country because it's strategically important to them, it's kind of is imperialism. You're kind of considering them your protectorates or empire at the very least. You are. And this is sort of the natural progression of the Monroe Doctrine. The natural progression of Monroe Doctrine is to one of, we're going to have these sorts of things. We're going to have this sort of statement. I'd also like to point out, this is about Japan in 1912. Japan in 1912. Again, people like to think about the American-Japanese relations, and they usually focus on post-World War I and all these things. But honestly, America and Japan have a fractious relationship from the very beginning. Because, in argument part, because of how the Americans open up Japan, but also, arguably because the Americans are a bit shocked by how fast the Japanese push forward. The Japanese, in many ways, take the Americans by surprise. They are Orientals. They are not supposed to be doing what they're doing. And it especially takes as surprise the politicians who don't know much about Japan. Now, it's no surprise to me that this is so sort of structured as it is on the Japanese. Because it's being started by the Japanese getting involved in these things. Because, again, let's consider, what happens if that had been a British company? Do we think the Americans would have reacted the same if it had been a British company looking at Magdalene Bay than the Japanese? Anyone? Want to put that in the chat? You know, would they have reacted the same? Because, and this is beyond even the racial one, this is just the sort of the standard question. I'm going to start the poll. So the poll should be appearing. Should be, he says. Let's see how many results come in. It's going backwards and forwards. There seems to be a solid third of you saying yes, so there's about 2/3 saying no. Lions, sorry, I still don't understand people who would use 10 words to make a point, but instead could use 10 words. Usually you use the 250 to make the point when you are trying to make a point rather than 10 words. When you are trying to head off potential problems. Because the 10-word answer is the tip of the spear. The 10-word answer is what you give at the beginning. I usually try and structure my answers to questions, especially when students, is that I try and answer it in the first 10 words, and then I give more information when I'm talking. Then when I'm, I then expand upon it and give them the fuller detail, so they have the wider context and nuance of it. You can answer in 10 words, but you can't give the context and nuance which justifies your answer in those 10 words. Should be seeing a poll on YouTube. Drakenred. I'm sorry I can't. I don't yet know how to do the polling on Twitch. I'm sorry to the Twitch viewers. As soon as I can work out how to do it and to get it to do it on both at the same time, I will. Yeah. The Americans weren't 2-0 against the Brits. They were, I would say, the American War of Independence. They won, but that was also because of the wider war they're involved. And the War of 1812, if it hadn't when it ended when it did, when the British were starting to free up resources from Europe, it could have got very bad very quickly. It was basically, for both sides, it was a case of, you really misjudged this and we don't want this. But, you know. I think the British occupied Maine during the War of 1812. I'm still not sure. The British, and I think the British are actually calling it the colony New Ireland from memory. It's not something I've really looked into a lot of, but yeah, it was a weird scenario at the time. Yeah, I did. So I saw that, but also I'm kind of answering comments now at the moment as well because I'm sort of letting the poll do its thing, and I don't want to. If I move on while people are still doing a poll, it'll make it weird. But I am again apologising to Twitch. I haven't yet learned how to do a poll on Twitch. If I can figure it out, and if I can do a poll, I will be doing polls on Twitch as well. Oh, it's a fun time. It is a fun time. So I'm going to end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to wait till I see my hand doing that countdown, and then I'm going to, use that as my time to end the poll. That's how I tend to do these things. So I make sure, because I realise there is a slight delay on the broadcast, so I wait till I see my hand doing the countdown. Ended poll. So we got 75% for no, 24% for yes, 33 votes. Thank you very much, and that's broadly speaking. There is a possibility they react the same with the British, but I don't think they would have reacted in quite the same way. I also think possibly what they'd have done, what might have happened, is the British would have brought in an American company as a partner. And that's the thing. The British would have done something which would mean that the Americans would be voting against themselves. The Japanese, the team who were doing that didn't seem to realise that, from Japan, didn't seem to realise that was an option. But if you brought in a American corporation as a partner, and so it had been a joint Japanese-American exploitation of the land, what do you think? And the American reaction would have been very different. Even if the Japanese had still been the dominant partner, providing, let's say, 60%. Yeah, it does depend to an extent which company was behind it. So, after that, things carry on as they normally do, and they always normally do, and at this point, well, we have the Clark Memorandum. Now, Clarke is Under Secretary of State for Calvin Coolidge. And he didn't like the use of force in Latin American nations, to an extent. And his memorandum was actually held secret until it was released by Herbert Hoover's admin in 1930. For Japan to make a naval alliance with the Americans rather than Britain, and alliance with Britain, the Americans would have had to be the second power, not Britain, and Britain being the first power. Because that's basically the reason the Japanese ally with Britain is because they're the power who show up after the Americans, and the Japanese use them to counterbalance the Americans. So if the British had been the ones to force over Japan, then the Japanese probably formed the alliance with the Americans. So, yeah, that's it could cause a different relationship. It could do. Now, the Clark Memorandum is different. Clarke, and by the way, he puts forward these arguments in a 236-page report, okay? So when we're summarising this, we are summarising a 236-page document. And it is long. Again, I have got a link to it somewhere. Where is my link to it? I had a link to it because I had an online version of it. I can't find my link now. Broadly speaking, it goes through the following arguments. Every nation has the right to self-preservation. Self-preservation is what supports the Monroe Doctrine. The US there alone makes, decisions, as I've talked about when or what to intervene on Latin nations. The doctrine's not concerned with the relationship between the US and other nations in the Americas. It's only about preventing European interference in those nations. It does not, Monroe Doctrine, therefore, according to Clarke, only covers relationships with America and Latin nations on one side, and Europeans on the other side. It doesn't also cover American relationships with Latin American nations. Therefore, Roosevelt Corollary is not part of Monroe Doctrine, and Monroe should be applied to Latin America as beneficial, but the Roosevelt Corollary is not part of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, it becomes public because of Secretary of State Stinson in the Hoover admin, who's arguing for a good neighbor policy towards Latin American nations, which basically comes down to the Big Brother scenario again. It's most famous in most of my circles because it's the first usage, as we understand it, in a recorded document of the phrase national security, which is why I have a link to it, because I tend to use it when I'm talking about national security. Now, the poll is only running for another 2 minutes. There's a poll running on Twitch. I don't know if I managed to put a Twitch poll. If someone else did a Twitch poll, I think I did mention it. On Twitch, so hopefully that helped. Anyway, so to get back to the Clark Memorandum, it's an interesting document because it's coming forward the idea that okay, this document doesn't govern our relationships with Latin America, but think about it. The very function of Monroe Doctrine does actually refine there to be an interest in a sort of relationship going on, and that America is leading it. Because otherwise, what right does America have to interfere in the affairs of those countries by interceding with the European powers? There is a fundamental flaw in Clarke's thinking, but that doesn't mean Roosevelt is right. That means that the Monroe Doctrine doesn't enunciate these things, and so you can read into it what you will. You can go for a very narrow definition, if you wish to, but the reality is the definition, by its very nature, because it does require America to intercede in these circumstances, does mean they're going to be getting involved in the foreign policy and possibly the domestic and security policies of those Latin American nations if they're actually going to enforce it. Thank you, Melanie. You managed to make a poll. Thank you. I think there's only about 3 people watching on Twitch, but thank you for making a poll. Thank you for doing that. I'm going to have to sort that out so that they get triggered at the same time in future, and it works together. We'll see what we can do. We'll see what we can do. Thank you. Now, the Clark Memorandum is a fun one. It's a fun document, but it's not as fun as what happens in World War II. Because they've got out of the interwar years, they've got into World War II, and in World War II there's problems with the Vichy French. What are the problems with the Vichy French? Well, and this almost causes a problem inside the American government, because some Pierre Miquelon, okay? Some Pierre Miquelon are part of the French Vichy French area, but they are reconquered by the Free French. Now you'd think, well, hang on, what's the problem here? Because they're already existing part of that European nation, and more than that, Saint Pierre and Miquelon, they're off the coast of Canada. They're off the coast of Canada. Well, what? But no, again, Cordell Hull here, the American Secretary of State, calls it a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. That's in December 1941, by the way. And it's argued by some that his reaction to that, and his very loud reaction to that, in December 1941, caused issues in terms of getting the nation, the Allies to start working together, especially with ABDA command, etc., where Free French could have been involved. But I would also, it's one of those points that sit there and go, why are you arguing this at this point? But he feels he should do. He feels he should. But I think it is also strange is that the Americans also feel that they will defend, and they actually do a national survey in 1940, that they decided that if anyone tried to invade Canada, 81% of the Americans were apparently happy to go and defend Canada. 75% were happy to defend Mexico and Central America. 69% the South America, 66% West Indies, and 59% were able to happy to go and defend Greenland. And by the way, that comes from What USA Thinks, published in 1940. I am going to put a link here, but please note there's also some absolutely comedic pictures of French leaders and French leadership involved, and some very interesting pictures of the Home Guard. Very interesting pictures of the Home Guard. But I'm going to give you a link to this one, because I had this sources. I like to give links where I can in the chat when I'm live, because it's nice. It was actually after the 7th, I think, from memory. But yeah, ABDA command is a fun one. Yeah, there are lots of differences going on at this point. The Monroe Doctrine is fine. The Monroe Doctrine is fun. The Monroe Doctrine continues into the Cold War. And in the Cold War, it causes even more issues. It causes even more issues because, well, it's the Cold War, and it's always going to cause issues. The Americans start to rewrite it to include, from basically Dulles onwards, who's the Secretary of State in 1954, he brings up the Pan-American, the Monroe Doctrine at the 10th Pan-American Conference to denounce communism in Guatemala. Kennedy even gets involved, saying that, well, in this one of this lovely quotes, and we all know that President Kennedy does love his quotes, and his conferences tend to be quite long. Again, he does, but not as long as Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's. I'm just looking for. Please note, I'm looking for the start of the section in the. I have a link to it, and I'm hunting through Wayback Machine to find what I'm looking for. I had it highlighted earlier, but it's managed to move. I love the Wayback Machine. Sometimes it really does love to move on me. How am I going to find this? I'm just going to copy and paste this to a Word document now. I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to alt and out nick it, okay? So no one listen to me saying that, because I'm just putting it into a Word document so I can find the section I've had earlier. I should have just done this earlier, then I would have been able to find it far more quickly. This is question 21. Question. Sir, would you tell us what the Monroe Doctrine means to you today in light of world conditions and in Cuba? This is from Kennedy's response. The Monroe Doctrine means what is meant since President Monroe and John Quincy Adams enunciated it. And that is that we would oppose a foreign power extending its power into the Western Hemisphere. And that's why we oppose what's happening in Cuba today. That's why we've cut off our trade. That's why we worked with OAS and in other ways to isolate the communist menace in Cuba. That's why we'll continue to give a good deal of our effort and attention to it. Bold words. Bold words. But for most of South America, what it meant was the Americans getting involved, where in the widening of the active parts of the war of the Cold War. The active parts of the Cold War. And the active parts of the Cold War were the revolutions and counter-revolutions, often in other areas. You know, there's the Cuban Revolution, but also the US providing military aid and intelligence and all sorts of things to various Latin and South American governments when they, under Operation Condor, when they claimed to be threatened by communism, and, you know, they were also getting involved in sort of the Nicaraguan Contras and all sorts of things. The CIA really did get involved in a lot of operations from the point of view to try and keep communists out and keep even the threat of communism out of South America. So it's not just keeping... Now it's not just expanded to keeping other nations out of America. It's not just expanded to keeping other companies belonging to other nations out of America, but it's also now other political ideologies out of the Americas. And you even have people arguing that, you know, if they don't intervene in places like Nicaragua, that would be a complete abandonment of the Monroe Doctrine. I think it was Robert Gates in 1984 who said that, but yeah, just checking my notes. He again has a whole... It's an interesting... it's one of my notes from one of the books. Which book was it from? Oh, I'll look that up later. But yeah. Basically, I've nicked quite a lot of comments from various books, so it is. Because the Monroe Doctrine is something which I often have to refer to and have to often return to when I'm talking about America in history, because it does set things apart. It's an interesting bit of history, and it's an interesting problem. But I do have now realised it's now 2 o'clock. It's now 2 hours in, and bang on cue, I'm starting to have things flash up on YouTube. So bang on cue, I'm going to do another ad. So I'm going to do one an hour. It makes YouTube happier with smaller channels. I'm not sure what Twitch is doing, by the way. Twitch just automates and does whatever it likes, so I do apologise for that. But it's supposed to be on the lowest setting it does and still give me any money eventually. But YouTube allows me to an extent to control it, and I like to make the ads as minimal as possible. And so I do one an hour. I got Amazon. What did other people get? Yeah. So, yeah, we're now out of the Cold War, and the Cold War is a mess for the Monroe Doctrine. It really is, but it's what carries on. And, well, post-Cold War, you really haven't had much said until you get to John Kerry. Other nations talk about it, but it doesn't really get evolved. It doesn't really get changed. And most presidents and most of the various governments seem happy to ignore it until you get to Obama and John Kerry, who likes to tell the Organization of American States that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over in 2013. I'm glad that Melon 1640. You got me yapping. That's good. If you got Prime or other things, you won't get an ad. Now, I would say that it's interesting is that when we talk about what Kerry talks about, he then goes on to talk about a brotherhood of nations, a mutual partnership, which of course, with America being the biggest economy in the largest pool of resources, etc., in there, the most food and all these things. America would dominate. So in many ways, what Kerry is actually saying when he's saying the era of Monroe is over, but it's now going to be mutual partnership and brotherhood, it's pretty much restating the original Monroe Doctrine. It's arguably more resetting back to the original Monroe Doctrine than it is changing the Monroe Doctrine. Because the Monroe Doctrine has evolved, and if we go back to that original phraseology, and it's quicker to go this way than it is to go the other way. Boom. If you go back to what was originally said, that's pretty much what they're talking about to an extent. We are a brotherhood. Basically, it's a case of, yeah, we're all not... European nations, other nations aren't going to interfere. We're all going to just be good together and happy together, in a way. But the thing is, that's not really a viable option, is it? It's not really, because it's not the way the world works. The world's a functioning global economy. It was then, it is now. Now, the thing is, the other stuff that's happened is that since then we've had I would say, since Obama's, especially first term, there's been a realization, a change in international relations. There has been. There's been a realization that, maybe the world isn't going to be permanently peaceful from now. Maybe nations are still acting like nations always have. Maybe we haven't evolved. Maybe it's not so much a scenario of how do I put this politely? War is over. We have end of history. All those things. And I would say, in many ways, Trump has returned to Monroe Doctrine, but it's closer in many ways to the Roosevelt version of the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, than the actual Monroe Doctrine. And in many ways, it's more this one. Kerry's announcement was more a return to the original, resetting to the original, and you've quickly evolved because of the world from what the original stated in a scenario where Britain was the dominant power and actually was really going to do the enforcing. Then the Monroe Doctrine worked, but when you're the power who has to do the enforcing, then you have to go with the Roosevelt methodology. And in many ways, I would say, again with this, that both sides of the, and especially the modern American political debate around the Monroe Doctrine, there is a measure of rhetoric and speaking to domestic political causes, and then there's the reality once you're in charge. What can you do? What do you need to do? What affects your interests? What is going to cause you trouble? There is always a measure when it comes to foreign policy of you can have the highest ideals you want, but often you end up getting grubby. Often the world doesn't. It's basically, I would say, when I look at the sides, and I'm not talking about the individuals here, I'm talking about the real effects of their foreign policy. Kerry's, Obama's, this sort of era was of high ideals of foreign policy. High ideals. I would say this one is more dealing with the world as it is and trying to deal with the world as it is now. The world is not thinking that humans have got any better in the world. But they also have their own domestic policies to deal with. Trump got elected on America First, making America great, all that rhetoric. And that's good electoral rhetoric. It is good campaign speak. Turning that into government and turning it into action in government is difficult. It always is. And just, you want to have a good example, look at the UK. Labour Party got elected with all sorts of promises. What are they going to be able to deliver? They're now facing the reality of what they've actually done, a situation. And it was the same with the Conservatives, and it's the same. It's why, in many ways, you are not, when you're looking at elections, you almost are not voting for policies. You're voting for the modus operandi of how people are going to make decisions. Because very few, if you go through elections, very few promises from parties that are getting elected ever get enacted because the world gets in their way. There is nothing. I do not want to critique people for having high ideals in foreign policy. It's always nice. You want to have the high ideals. The high ideals of where humanity should be going, they are a wonderful thing to aim for. They are something we should all aspire to. But you have to deal with the reality to get there. You can't just hope for the high ideals and the world's going to become it. That's the lesson of history. It's a case of you need, sometimes you just need both. Honestly, I'm not going to get into the politic debates, domestic things. I'm just talking about the Monroe Doctrine and their views of it. Rhetoric can be toxic. Rhetoric can be uplifting. Let's be honest. If you go back to Teddy Roosevelt's speech, that's got plenty of rhetoric in it. It's long, it's verbose, but it's also full of rhetoric. So the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine it's a complex bit of history, but it's worthwhile considering this picture again. This picture in its expanded form. Because you have the rest of Europe dressed in their nobility and finery. You have an English country gentleman. You have him protecting, and also the American perception of what their South American, Latin American partners were like. This speaks as much as how America views Latin America and South America as it does the reality of the situation. The Monroe Doctrine for, I would say, from 1823 to about 1923 depends more on the British than it does on the Americans. Realistically, it's only after 1923 the Americans have the logistics, infrastructure, and things in place that they can actually start to enforce it properly without the British assisting them in some ways. And sometimes the way the British were assisting them was literally by getting in front. You look at how the British are acting, they get in front, they've got the people behind them, and then they steer them. Those arms behind them, keeping them back. Because for the British, it was about access to markets. It was about being able to trade. For the Americans, in some ways, it's about status. Now, I'm going to start answering questions in a second, but I'm just going to go see what all the woofing going on in the kitchen is about, just quickly, because it sounds like there might have been something dropped, and I just want to check everyone's okay. It's all okay, Fluff. Someone dropped some butter on the floor, and apparently your brother is doing his level best to clear it all up. No, you don't want butter. Butter's not good for poodles. You get that. You're a good boy. You're a good boy. Hello, everyone. So, questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will attempt to try and answer them. And after I've gone through some questions here for about, let's say about half an hour to an hour, I will, no, let's say up to about 40 minutes, let's say. So I'll sort of get the thing up to roughly 3 hours long. I will then pop over to Discord and chat to people there. How are you doing, Big Fluff? Do you want to come up in my lap now? Is that it? Okay. Alright, Big Fluff. Oh. Okay. Good boy. Right, so, let's answer some questions. How's the Monroe Doctrine affected when the SS Central America sank on the... which destroyed the US... It didn't really destroy the US economy and didn't really change the Monroe Doctrine. They still have the doctrine. They have the same reality of how they can afford things. Yeah, there's no real changes in that period. The big change coming in that period is going to be the American Civil War. And yeah, 1857 did not destroy the U.S. economy. We consider how much the U.S. economy expands in the Civil War and what happens then. Yeah. Raji, how would the Monroe Doctrine have changed if in the Cold War a South American nation develops atomic weapons? That's going to be a big problem for the Americans, because it's like they have issues when there's the naval races going on in South America. There are periods when the South American navies are stronger than the American Navy, are more powerful than the American Navy, and that causes huge issues for the Americans, because their entire image and the psychological image with the Monroe Doctrine, as propagated through the Monroe Doctrine but shown off by it, is that they are the major power, they are the leading nation. And whenever they realize they're not, it causes them to go into massive psychological meltdown. It's quite an interesting piece of history. And it's one of the reasons why the British have to be very careful what they base in Canada. It's the fun thing, and the fun question is, if the Canadians did get some Queen Elizabeth class battleships, how's that going to affect the Americans? Well, there's going to be arguments about the Monroe Doctrine, etc., but in a nice way, it's just going to cause them to invest a lot in their navy. Because it's going to be seen as yeah. Would you consider Fordville, the episode in the Monroe Doctrine, the greatest reach of American history in time, or was there a better example? I'm not sure I would consider Fordville more an example of the Monroe Doctrine, or more of an example of American attempt to export itself. And American capitalism and their paternalistic view, Big Brother view of their southern neighbors. There are interesting issues the Americans have in terms of their relationship and how they perceive it. The Americans are often caught short when it comes to diplomacy by their own perceptions of countries. And I'm not saying America's unique in this. Other countries often have the problem as well. But I would say America gets more prone to this than others, because America has a habit of not listening to their own diplomats. I'm not even pretending to listen to their own diplomats, which you can sort of understand sometimes, but it doesn't really help them when it comes to foreign policy. Oh, there we go. Right. You comfortable? Good. Good boy. There is also United Fruit and various other things as well, which are also part of the same thing. It's all part of the same scenario. You have to remember the Monroe Doctrine is as much about America's view of its position in the world as it is about America's international relations. Yes, it caused a panic, the Night 6831, but that didn't destroy the economy. And destroying the economy is a very different statement than causing a panic, causing problems. It's not going to, and that doesn't affect the Monroe Doctrine, because the Americans are still doing what they still can't do anything like they couldn't anything before the Monroe Doctrine, before the 57. And there is nothing in 1858 that they couldn't have done. They couldn't have done in 1856. Yes, £30,000 of gold is a lot of money to lose. But it doesn't destroy the American economy. It causes trouble. It's a lot of money to go away, especially when you're on the gold standard. But the thing is, how much gold was still sitting in America's vaults? A lot of gold. So yeah, this is. Look, there are people who write up all sorts of things about these things causing trouble, but ultimately, they don't. I've had discussions, people recently that, have basically said, oh, yeah, when the Great Depression caused Britain to go Britain to declare bankruptcy. And I went, when did Britain declare bankruptcy in the Great Depression? I went, it must have done. It was bankrupt, but it didn't. No point was it bankrupt. It was economically straightened, it was under stress, yes, and it was a blow to it. And as I've said before, there are multiple blows in succession which destroy the British economy because each one takes it down further and further, and then they don't have a chance. They don't have the ability to recover. But yeah. I don't think we should be getting into a long discussion about Ukraine and those sort of things, because that's Europe. That's not Monroe Doctrine. That's a whole different ball game. Yeah, the Hudson Bay or East India Company are fun. They are argued to be the fruit companies, and Fordville are argued to be the American versions of Hudson Bay and East India Company, but they're not really. They don't take control of territories. That's got neither the East India Company or the Hudson Bay Company were government run. Neither were government run. The East India Company ends up getting taken over by the British government because they are being run so badly, but they're not government run. Good boy. Yes, you're very good. You seem to be having a nice time. Yes, you do. So if South American nations had been more stable through the 1800s, and this was more than they did on this time, the original historic timeline, how could this have affected the Monroe Doctrine? It could have made it even more of a bit of a joke at certain points, because if the South American nations are more advanced at certain points in the 1800s and 19th century, they would have been well in advance. You have to consider the Brazilian economy at some points does very, very well. It's the lack of stability, and it's the instability in those governments which causes them the trouble. Ronald, that's how the least worst faction. They have healthcare. Are you sure that healthcare works to keep you healthy? Again, Stafford. No, later. You can have that argument on Discord. In the politics section of the Discord, not in the history section of it. So yeah, it's the Monroe Doctrine is one of these things which has been adapted by many to believe all sorts of things. And there are times when I have heard people talking about the Monroe Doctrine, and I go, well, that's not the Monroe Doctrine. They go, yes, it is. I go, no, that's the Corollaries. That's the other thing. The amount of times the Corollaries are interpreted as the Monroe Doctrine, and they're not. Corollaries are literally interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine. So they're not the doctrine itself, they're what the current government or the existing interpretation of that doctrine is. What have you got going on here? That's nasty. Oh. Pebble. Oh. Need to get done? Okay. Pebble. Poor Fluff. Okay. How things change if instead of being taken from a presidential speech, it's done from a report from the get-go? The thing is, if you actually have it done from a report, and if you have a congressional law passed on it, you have it more codified. One of the things I would say about the Monroe Doctrine is it wasn't even called the doctrine for most of the period we're talking. It's called the Monroe Theory. And it's an evolving piece of the Monroe Doctrine and its interpretations are much about America's view domestically of what their external role should be, as it is about what their role actually is. It's also interesting because often in the periods when America is supposed to be the most isolationist, they are the most strict expansionist in terms of how much control they feel they should exercise over the wider Western Hemisphere, as I like to call it, or the Americas. He had a furball in the 1961. The thing is, and this is going to sound terrible, but when you live with a corgi, getting a furball is a fact of life. We try to avoid them, don't we? We try. But yeah, you get furballs. Also, it doesn't help, and I'm not going to describe this in graphic detail, but when as in terms of fluffs, they lick certain parts of themselves to clean themselves, they tend to also get fur into their mouths. So coughing up fur balls is a fact of life we induce on ourselves to keep ourselves clean, isn't it? Big fluff. Personally, myself, I prefer a shower, but every time I mention the word bath to someone, they immediately start to try and hide. Black Moses, we thought if the British took Hawaii as a coaling station protectorate, then if the British had taken it in the 60 years they had the opportunity to do so, they would have taken it, and then the Americans would have probably accepted it and ignored. Americans would probably have focused on Guam or somewhere else. Galapagos Islands always seems to be attractive to them for some reason. Everyone else looks at Galapagos Islands and goes, who the frigate wants to be there? But the Americans always seem to be going, imagine if we had the Galapagos Islands. Oy. Oh, don't worry, I worked that out, Black Moses. Stefan, how would Chile and Argentina be different if the US had taken more of a role in their independence from Spain, instead of half-pay Royal Navy admirals becoming legends or nightmares? It's interesting. The Americans don't really have the people to send. This is part of the trouble, okay? This is one of the reasons why it is the British who are sent. Because the British would have quite happily for the Americans to go. Would have been quite happy. It wouldn't cause us any issue. Given us even more layers of plausible deniability. But the thing is, the Americans don't have a standing navy, don't have the same size standing navy or army, and don't have the reputation the British have at this point. So they don't have the personnel they can send. They're not going to do anything. American adventurers do go. They are helpful. They do try their best, but honestly, they are limited. They mainly come with money. They don't come with military experience, or even more importantly, with larger power, with access to the sort of resources and cachet and background which makes recruiting people viable. So that's their problem. You know, in the nicest way. One of the problem with the Monroe Doctrine often was, as seen, you know, here you've got this, he's holding this rifle, he's, you know, standing proud. Often the Americans don't have the rifle. One of the really fun things is, that's the German, the Prussian, Prussian/German at the front there. And militarily, for quite a lot of that period, Prussia, if the British didn't get in their way and didn't say, no, it won't happen, could have wiped the floor of America. Because the sheer amount of troops they could bring. The sheer amount of force. So the problem is, it's like, sort of, this cartoon is great because it shows Uncle Sam standing strong, but it also shows the fact that Uncle Sam's position is to an extent a bit uncertain, and it's a much about old Bull, John Bull, holding them back. Because it works for both these nations. The Monroe Doctrine, the neutrality to seas, the other powers being kept out of South America and not causing trouble, works for these nations. And it's interesting to note that it's when there's issues, the only time there are issues are when it's both these nations don't really care about what's going on. Or for most of the period, it's when this nation doesn't really care about what's going on. Or if they are prepared to let the people be involved. And if the British had intervened in the Mexican-American War on the side of the Mexicans, there would have been a lot of problem for the Americans. There would have been a lot of problems, because the amount of supplies the British could have given to the Mexicans would have been massive. But also, the amount of issues their Royal Navy could have caused for the American Navy and its existence this time would have been again horrendous, and the Americans would have been fighting a two-front war. But the British weren't going to do that, because as far as they were concerned, it didn't interfere with their issues. Think about it from another perspective. What were the British interests in Mexico versus what were the British interests in South America? Next patron suggestions are going to be running probably this week, and they're going to be running for February. So we've got we've got December and January lined up, and so I'm going to start doing February in December, and then I'm going to do March in January, and then I'm going to do April in February, and that sort of thing, to try and keep things far ahead. Also, the odds are the ship-shaped trip is going to be later in the year than it was this year, so it's going to be moved back a bit, but that's quite a good thing in some ways. It's a good thing in some ways. Gives more time for everyone to get ready. Habsburg interest in Mexico? As always, Habsburgs might have interests, but do the British government have interests? Does Britain have an interest? That's what matters. How do you get your supplies through American waters? American Navy not big enough to get over the British? Not during the Mexican-American War. It's not. The Mexican-American War of 1846, the size of the Royal Navy versus the size of the American Navy in that period is not even funny. It's not even funny to think about. And the size the Royal Navy couldn't grow to quite quickly is not even... Basically, and again, it's not that America couldn't have built up the resource and infrastructure to build up a navy to rival the British in this period. They could have done. But that would require a lot of investment in infrastructure and construction going on for years. Because, you have to remember, especially in this period, the ships are still heavily wooden in 1840s. And the British have a lot more than the Americans do. It looks like it could be moving back slightly further than August, has it? Mainly because we've been advised by a couple of museums that it would be a nightmare for them to sort of have us in the June-July period. We're sort of going, okay, we'll sort of work this out, and when can we work this out with our things? And of course, you've got clearing for Gareth to work through and all that stuff. So it might end up being September, October, but I'm going to be confirming all the details soon and putting it up. I'm going to work it all out. But yeah, basically, standard. It's not a case of, it's very rarely is it a case of me saying the Americans are bad, and when I talk about the fact their capabilities versus the Royal Navy in this period, it's more a reality of Congress hasn't invested in anything. The Royal Navy in the 1840s is pretty darn large. Between 1840 and 1880, the Royal Navy will have roughly nearly 1,700 vessels. Operating across the fleet. If the 1812 war had gone bad after the British, The British were happy to let it be, but you have to remember when the war ends, the British are in control of Maine and a few other parts of America. And nice as well, if the negotiations hadn't started when they had, and the British government had been more concerned with what was going on and kept better details of what was going on and what they were winning, there might have been forced territorial concessions. But also, there's very much the realization in Britain that what they want is to not have to deal with this again. They don't want to have this as a problem. They'd rather have it over. So you basically have a variation of a peace deal, and then the Monroe Doctrine, and all these things build up to make it so that Britain and America are going to be friendly for a long time. Let's see. I think the Royal Navy in ships of the line. In 1840s, the Royal Navy builds 8 first-rate ships of the line, and another 7. Ooh, hang on, no, that's more. That's 22 second rates of the line and a couple of third rates of the line, and they are mostly either turned into screw battleships, i.e. with screw propellers added into them and steam, or, in this period as well. The sheer amount of unarmoured steamships of the line the Royal Navy is operating in this period is quite disturbing. And the sheer amount of ships they have from the 1830s as well, still in service, and the fact is the Royal Navy has enough ships sitting in ordinary that if they start activating, they will have not only more first rates than the Americans have frigates. They will have more first rates than the Americans have ships at one point, I think, because of how the U.S. Navy has been neglected. And it's one of those things of the Americans post the War of 1812, 1812, 1814, have an opportunity. They are building ships. They have a capability there, and they immediately neglect it. They immediately neglect it. There is the fact that the United States orders the well, they were all cancelled there. The Independence class, US's independence was razed in 1836, so she's gone from being a ship of the line down to being a razee. Washington is only around till 43. Franklin's around to 52. Columbus is around to 61, and some of them are around in name only. Pennsylvania's around to 61. Delaware to 61. Again, notice it's the Civil War when they're trying to reactivate them and they realize they have to admit how bad a condition they're in. The sheer number of ships not built. Yeah. But if the US lost Maine and maybe some other land after the War of 1812, wouldn't that be a cause of possible conflict later on, or the US not coming to the aid of losing World War I? It could potentially be a cause of conflict later on, but the British would probably attach Maine to Canada. So, honestly, it probably wouldn't. And the reality is, the loss of Maine is not going to affect America that much. As much as I love Maine, and as much as I have many friends from Maine, and I do remember them all, I probably, should I start saying hello to them specifically in case they're watching it? No, but I'm going to say hello. Let's be honest, Maine is not going to be a place the Americans are going to be too upset if it's part of Canada rather than America. It's not a major resource hub and major centre for them, economically or politically. So if the British activate all their ships at a time, they could march an army to America's run. Not realistically, there's not enough for that, but they could certainly have floated out quite a lot of them. Yeah, the US at the time had the same disease as the Roman Empire develops towards the end of its life. They build stuff up, then let it crumble, and then have to spend money to build up again. It wouldn't be the 20th Maine at Gettysburg. No, but there'll be another regiment. Derp Squad deals. I would like to point out that the British occupation of Maine was really not that difficult. One of the things which is often pointed out is that Maine did not really object to being occupied by the British. It was really rather amenable to the subject. In some regards. Basically, Maine didn't have many problems, and if you look at it, there's probably a reason why. And also, it's the parts of Maine which were actually occupied. Let me put it this way: Maine, I don't think it would have caused a whole host of problems. I think it would just be part of Canada. I think it would be more problematic if the British had managed to, I don't know, get down to as far as Syracuse and Portsmouth and managed to form a line across that way. Because if the British have got the entirety of that line across New York State, then and Vermont, I've got Vermont and New York State, parts of New York State as well as Maine. That would cause an issue. I think Maine, as much as again as I love it, it's a lovely place. It's a beautiful place. Yeah, I don't think it would be causing that trouble. Yeah, it's an interesting scenario. It is, there are also possibly a fair number of people in Maine who were, how do I put it, economically as well at the time. Maine actually had, because of their position, a lot of connections going on and a lot of trade going on with Britain, even at that point. And that caused also the other issues. Mm-hmm. I'm not being rude. I am checking why I'm getting so many WhatsApp messages buzzing through from my family right now, what they're currently complaining about. I'm not sure what's going through, but there's something complaining. They're being very vocal about something. But yeah, Annika, all respect to Maine. Maine is a lovely place. Okay, just gonna say that out there because yeah, I know you're watching, and I did get the message. But yeah. I'm sorry, I don't. I think if the war had, that had been factored in, I think there would have been less of, the Americans wouldn't have bothered quite as much. It would have been a case of the line just continues on to St. Andrews, the border just continues straight to St Andrews, like it, then that might have been acceptable. Yeah, there is some advantages for Canada in having Maine, but yeah, it's one of those things of the world would move, the world would adapt. And by guys, that's too many. That's too many questions to answer in terms of this sort of. That's too many points on before for me to answer this topic, and really, I'm not enough of a specialist to be able to tell you. But my view from the negotiations and from what was being said at the time and what was viewed at the time, and what I've had from friends who do research in that area, is realistically the Americans. There were quite a large faction of Americans who were, if they lost Maine, they weren't going to bother too much. New England is different. Yeah. Well, let's put it this way: you have both a big. If you have that sort of area, Maine and those sort of things, honestly, they're not going to change it much. They are mostly rural areas, and honestly, they are lovely areas. They are lovely territory. They're lovely countryside. They're beautiful. I don't think it shifts the balance of power much between two nations. I don't think the Portland being Canadian rather than American is really going to change things dramatically. And yeah, as I said, I could see the Americans fighting for Vermont, New Hampshire, and those areas because those start to have a lot of value, and maybe there's going to be a bit of a tussle over Portsmouth and that sort of area of New York, or rather New Hampshire. But yeah, it's not. Again, it's Maine is standard Canada. I don't think the Americans go to war with Canada specifically to get Maine back. I don't think that becomes a war cry. We want Maine. Honestly, it would probably change the legacy of the War of 1812, though, because it would mean it would be how it would be viewed would not be would it be necessarily viewed as a win if they've lost Maine? Would it be tangible proof we weren't winning this war when it ended? That's an interesting question to get into, and how does that affect the American psyche? But yeah, the British had taken pretty much most of Maine. Yeah, there's all sort of articles, but basically the British have got to count down to Castine and have taken all areas. So basically they've taken half of Maine. So, and specifically have taken all the area which is near Quebec and New Brunswick and all that sort of part of it. So they've really strengthened their position as far as that's involved. It's a bit of history. It's the War of 1812 is a whole weird war because you also have the fact that at various points there is actual honest conversations going on between both sides of why the frig are we fighting each other? Shall we just not fight each other? And you sometimes have to find very active commanders on both sides for there to actually be battles. One of the fun things, though, is the British, while doing it, collected something like £10,000 in customs duties during the occupation. And they used that money to establish the Dalhousie University in 1818. Turkey in August, you get temperatures above 4 degrees centigrade most days. Yeah, I'm thinking end of September, into October. I'm thinking that period, because that's going to be better for us temperature-wise. We were warned at one point that our drones might melt in the sun. But again, relatively little. There's some privateers able to get to sea, but not much. At 18, yeah, Maine is not going to affect the American economy. A loss of half of Maine is not going to affect the American economy that greatly. It's not going to boost the Canadian economy that massively either. This is the reality of it. And whilst it is something which people really get excised over, in that period, it might well be seen as the cost of doing business. And for the British, it's an advantage to have it because it's going to stop Canada being so easily cut off from the sea and shorter, make give them a slightly greater defensible area. And for the Americans, it's not going to cost them much, but it's going to be enough. And there were some people who were arguing for, who probably would have liked it from the American side because it would have embarrassed the president and been able to something they could use against that political party for quite a long time. So, with that being said, I think we're almost approaching the 3-hour mark. And so I'm going to say final questions, and then I'm going to end. What have we got coming up? Well, it's not here we've got anything coming up, is it? It's this document which we've got stuff coming up. Or rather this one, next week what we have integrated anti-submarine warfare as the Thursday video. Tomorrow we have a key aircraft video which I'm going to record at some point tomorrow morning because I meant to try and record it today, but the power, the internet and the plumbing went down. So it was fun. It was fun. But yeah, we've got HMS Castleman coming out on Monday. It was supposed to come out last Monday, but it got all the computer systems went wrong. We've got two submarines. The submarine sort of discussion the whole way through of what happened, the various losses of ships to the submarines, sinkings of HMS. HMHS, His Majesty's Hospital Ship Britannic and IJS Congo. And we've got books for your history lover, which, again, Fleet needs to send me his address to get the books sent to him. I will try and get them delivered to him overnight. I've had a patron has come through, yay. So I will try and get them delivered to him overnight. But he needs to send me his address. I have sent him a note, but I'm also telling you all, because just in case any of you feel like nagging Fleet to remind him. Stafford, I'm fairly sure the ship will be named something else. Or it might be named USS Maine still. seeing as the Americans would still have Maine, just not the same whole of Maine. Next year's topic is the year of leadership. This year was the year of the aircraft carrier. Next year is the year of leadership. Then we're going to decide what's going to be topics for the thing after that. Can we get some audiobooks in that list? Yes, there will be some books which come in audiobook form in that list. And I'm going to try and make the primers come out in audiobook form. They will come out. It might well be me and Drac recording them, but we'll see. I might well send him and go, you know how you owe me favors for recording things for you? Yes. You know how you love me as your friend, and I am so kind and helpful and wonderful. Yeah. Can you do this favor for me? Yeah. He'll probably go yes, because he's always kind and helpful. Oh. You're now to the first poll. Good. Ryan, thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to finish this, and I'm going to go to Discord. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. I always do. And as I said, there's going to be a long patrol come from this. But there's going to be some interesting stuff coming up. The Battle of Barents Sea. There's all sorts of things being put in here coming up. The Battle of Illy. I've tried to make it as interesting as possible. And again, if we go back to this, these are the lives from Patreon. These are the premieres and lives from Patreon coming up over December and January. They're a good set. Thank you very much for watching, and, well, thank you. Take care.